Facebook is pervasive. The world's population is over 7 billion. Close to 3 billion of us are active Facebook users. And that scale creates power. The power to turn off the news.
In breaking news this morning, social media giant Facebook has followed through on its threat, restricting people in Australia from viewing news content.
The power to turn off those in power.
Facebook have extended their block on Donald Trump's accounts for at least the next 2 weeks until Joe Biden's inauguration, accusing the president of using the platform to incite insurrection.
And the power to change how we connect, how we communicate. For better, says Facebook. For worse, says this former employee.
We have created tools that are ripping apart the social fabric of how society works.
Facebook is powerful, but is Facebook too powerful? Well, this is how Mark Zuckerberg sees its role.
Facebook is an idealistic and optimistic company. For most of our existence, we focused on all of the good that connecting people can do.
Idealistic, optimistic, focused on the good. Let's keep those words in mind as we consider three stories: the news ban in Australia, the storming of the Capitol in Washington, and first, a coup. This is Myanmar's military moving in to stop protesters gathering on the streets in early February. It had removed Aung San Suu Kyi's civilian government from power, and the man controlling the military is Commander-in-Chief Min Aung Hlaing. He's a fan of Facebook. He's been an active user for years. Not so much now. Facebook has taken down some of the military's pages because of, it says, repeated violations of our community standards prohibiting incitement of violence and coordinating harm. This looks straightforward. If you launch a military coup and threaten peaceful protests, you lose your Facebook page. But the story of Facebook's power in Myanmar is not straightforward. Here's why. This is a country of 54 million people, and over half of them have a Facebook account. That didn't happen by chance. 1/3 of people in Myanmar live in poverty. And to help people get online, Facebook removed all data charges and organised for the Facebook app to be preloaded on many phones. It worked. Listen to this technology reporter from the New York Times.
The entire internet is Facebook, and Facebook is the internet. Most people don't necessarily know how to operate or get on and navigate regular websites. They kind of live, eat, sleep, and breathe Facebook.
Soon, though, Facebook was accused of playing a determining role in grave crimes. In 2017, Rohingya Muslim villages were ransacked, people were murdered, hundreds of thousands fled into Bangladesh. And the UN says Facebook's platform helped create this.
We know that the ultra-nationalist Buddhists have their own Facebooks and really inciting a lot of violence and a lot of hatred against the Rohingya or other ethnic minorities. And I'm afraid that Facebook has now turned into a beast than what it was originally intended to be used.
Facebook was the main platform for sharing horrific content that incited violence against the Rohingyas. Mark Zuckerberg was asked about this in 2018, and he said, "What is happening in Myanmar is a terrible tragedy, and we need to do more." It has done more to remove content, and now it's closed the military's pages after a coup. But this is the same military that attacked the Rohingyas and which continued to use Facebook. The point being, in Myanmar, Facebook dominates how information is shared and decides who gets to share it. That's a lot of responsibility for one company. And if that's Facebook's role in Myanmar, next let's turn to Washington and the storming of the Capitol. This was early 2021. America's fractured politics were laid bare and were the very opposite of Mark Zuckerberg's ambition for America and for Facebook as he outlined them in 2017.
Today, when we look around, our society is still very divided. Right? So now I believe that we have a responsibility to do even more. Right? Not simply connect the world, but also work to bring the world closer together.
But is Facebook actually doing that? To consider that, we need to look at how Facebook works. This is a former president.
It's a social validation feedback loop that it's like it's exactly the kind of thing that a hacker like myself would come up with, because you're exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology.
And then a version of those concerns was seen in a 2020 leak to the Wall Street Journal. Internal Facebook documents warn our algorithms exploit the human's brain's attraction to divisiveness. If unchecked, it would continue to serve Facebook users more and more divisive content in an effort to gain user attention and increase time on the platform. But can we connect the experience of being on Facebook with real-life actions? Well, 38 Congress members think so. In the aftermath of the storming of the Capitol, they sent a letter to Mark Zuckerberg saying perhaps no single entity is more responsible for the spread of dangerous conspiracy theories at scale and for inflaming anti-government grievance than the one that you started. And this is Democrat Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook bear partial responsibility for Wednesday's events.
One New York Times columnist wrote, Facebook pumps paranoia and disinformation into the body politic, the toxic byproduct of its relentless drive for profit. And there again is that accusation that technology designed to make a product popular has ended up undermining democracy and encouraging prejudice. Well, in response to the Capitol attack, Facebook's COO, Sheryl Sandberg, said, I think these events were largely organised on platforms that don't have our abilities to stop hate and don't have our standards and don't have our transparency. This, though, highlights a truth about Facebook's power. It is ruler of its vast domain, and it can remove whatever it likes, be that hate speech, or Donald Trump's account, or the news.
This is an assault on a sovereign nation. It is an assault on people's freedom, and in particular, it is an utter abuse of big technology's market power and control over technology.
The third story we're looking at is about how, without warning, Facebook removed all news content in Australia. And let's go back to Mark Zuckerberg in 2019.
Facebook is about putting power in people's hands.
But there wasn't power in the hands of Australians who get their news via Facebook. The news had vanished. Responding to this, Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison posted on, yes, Facebook, saying they may be changing the world, but that doesn't mean they run it. But Facebook is a company fighting for its interests, as companies do. In this case, it's over a row whether to pay news providers for content. But the context to the row is Facebook's scale. It's estimated that 40% of Australians use Facebook as their primary news source. That's a problem, according to this former Facebook executive.
I think he has too much power. We're seeing sovereign nations having to come up against Facebook, yet, we're not on the same playing field with Facebook's power.
And that concern has reached the UK. This is the head of the Competition and Markets Authority talking to the BBC.
I think it's a very worrisome development, and I think it really shows that we need to urgently do something to reduce this imbalance of power.
By turning off the news, albeit temporarily, Facebook showed its extraordinary power. And if countries feel they're at risk of being overpowered, a more fundamental issue arises. Here's my colleague, Rory Cleveland-Jones.
The only real action that can really affect Facebook is to break it up, and there will be growing discussion about that. Even in the United States, there are moves by certain Democratic congressmen to say this is the only way forward. It is too powerful. You can try little laws like this, but what you really need to do is lessen its power, and that means breaking it up.
Well, what happens next will in part be driven by President Biden, a man who we know sees Facebook as a problem. But as we consider these questions of Facebook's power, I find it useful to go back to that famous clip of David Bowie talking to the BBC about the internet.
I don't think we've even seen the tip of the iceberg. I think the potential of what the internet is going to do to society, both good and bad, is unimaginable. I think we're actually on the cusp of something exhilarating and terrifying.
I wanted to play that because the issues raised by Facebook are really fundamental issues raised by the internet. The Australia story is about old business models being broken, economies being restructured. The stories in Myanmar and America, in very different ways, show countries navigating the complete rearrangement of how we produce and consume information. These are vast political, economic and social shifts, and Facebook's right in the middle of all that. It does have extraordinary power, perhaps too much, but more powerful still is the internet and how it's changing every facet of our lives. That's the power that we're really wrestling with.
Now on BBC News, the media show, a spat between the Australian government and Facebook resulted in the Silicon Valley giant blocking every news organisation from its platform in Australia. The dispute has been resolved for now after Facebook backed down. But what does this display of might initially from Facebook mean for other countries preparing to take on big tech? Plus, the boss of news station Boom Radio on whether niche age-based services are the future.
Hello! Down with this obsession with youth. How about we obsess over older people instead? Baby boomers, for instance. After all, they're in the habit of actually watching and listening to linear telly and radio, and some of them even have money to spend after watching or listening to adverts. So goes the thinking behind a new radio station. No, not a digital platform available via smart devices. This is a real, actual radio station on DAB. It's called Boom Radio, it's aimed at boomers, and its founder joins us live. Meanwhile, over the past week, there has been a massive beef between Australia's government and Facebook, leading to the social media giant blocking every news organisation from their platform in Australia. But what does this display of might from Facebook mean for other countries readying themselves to regulate big tech, including Britain? That's all in today's media show. Let me introduce you to our guests. David Lloyd is the brains behind Boom Radio. He's also a presenter on the station and has been an executive in the commercial sector for years. David, I should say congratulations on getting a station off the ground. It's quite an achievement in a pandemic. How on earth did you manage to do it?
Oh, it's just crazy, isn't it? I mean, we're running it on a handful of people, and I'm sitting here where, you know, the heart of the radio station. This is where my sock drawer used to be. We've got presenters across the country broadcasting from their attics and bedrooms. But we've done it. You know, we've got this new radio station on air serving people who are over 60. And what's wrong with that?
You say sock drawer, so you are in your bedroom right now. This is the beating
the
heart of Boom Radio.
It is, yeah. My husband's three bedrooms away. The cable's dangling over the architraves to get there, and we're running this national radio station now.
And so, how big is this station that you've got off the ground in a pandemic?
Well, how big is it? I mean,
the audience, obviously, you're going to say millions, but I mean, in terms of the number of people you've got working on it.
We've probably got about 15 presenters, and they're all working from their own homes. And, you know, it's just been great because some of these presenters were still doing some work. Others weren't, you know, 70, 80-year-olds, probably at their finest as authentic communicators, but actually weren't doing any work. And there was one we were trying to get sorted out. We'd installed the kit. They hadn't used hadn't had a computer in the house before, actually had a smartphone, no computer. We got them set up. They did a dry run, and I rang them up to say that was great. And they burst into tears and said, "You don't know how much that means to me."
Oh.
So, you know, this story is not just a story about the listeners. It's a story of, you know, us, a group of near pensioners getting together and doing the sort of, you know, Great Marigold Hotel and saying, come on, we could have our own radio station, surely.
Well, good on you. It's quite an achievement. We're going to dig into your strategy, but congratulations on getting it off the ground. That that we just heard, that exhalation, was from Gillian Reynolds, I think it's fair to say, legendary figure in the world of radio, and with good reason. She spent 7 years as the radio critic at The Guardian, a mere 42 years at the Daily Telegraph, and was not so long ago poached, weren't you, Gillian, by the Sunday Times? What have you been listening to this week, Gillian?
I've been listening to an awful lot of music radio because David didn't like what I wrote about his radio station last Sunday. So I thought I will be fair to him. I will tune around. So I've tuned around. So I've listened to an awful lot of music radio this week, and I'm still pondering it. But I want to congratulate David for having got himself onto DAB, because I couldn't hear you on any of the DAB radio sets I have all around my house, my flat. I could only get you on my oldest tuner. And today, up you came on the radio dial. Great.
Oh, we've been there all the time, Gillian.
No, you haven't. No, you haven't.
We have.
No, I think you must have rushed out and paid the rent.
Listen, if you guys are going to have an argument, save it for about 7 or 8 minutes from now, because we're going to talk Facebook in Australia, and we'll come back to a good-natured discussion shortly. Let's look at the big story this week. I mentioned it at the top. People around the world have watched on in astonishment as Facebook has blocked all news pages in Australia briefly. From last Thursday until Tuesday of this week, Facebook users in Australia couldn't view or share the pages of the Sydney Morning Herald, The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, or any other news organisation, that ban or that blackout has now been reversed after a deal was reached. Latika Bork is our regular contributor. She's from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. She's which are obviously Australian titles, but is based here in London. Latika, good to see you again. Could you just explain the context, please, for this rather complicated story? What is it, Latika, that Facebook and the Australian government were arguing about?
So the Australian government has been trying to introduce a code. It's basically legislation that has gone through the parliament. It's going to be rubber stamped probably tomorrow morning. And what this code would have done was allow the Australian government to designate a tech company. Now, we're only talking two companies here. That's Google, that's Facebook. And what that code would have allowed the Australian government to do is force those companies into negotiation with the established media companies. So, for example, my mastheads are owned by a television channel called Nine. One of the big players in the Australian media landscape, of course, is Rupert Murdoch's News Corp. So at first, Google and Facebook both threatened to withdraw from Australia entirely rather than breach what they said was their business model and the open internet. Now, Google eventually came to the table and struck some one-on-one deals with my company, with News Corp, with Seven West, our rival. And Facebook was playing footsie with the companies. It was negotiating all the time up to the minute where it said, nope, we're going to pull out of Australia. Now, as of this morning, Amal, I still can't post on my Facebook page any news links. So Facebook have come back to the government and said, well, if you make some minor changes to this code, which is basically some more mediation time, then we will restore news pages. And so that is the situation at play now. And I should just stress that under this code, if the tech companies don't negotiate their own deals with the media companies, it would go to arbitration. Oh. So the tech companies would be forced to not just pay sums of money, the actual sum would be specified by an independent arbiter. So this is huge interventionist policy, and it is basically trying to address the monopoly that Google and Facebook have had over advertising revenue.
Gillian, did I hear you just exhale briefly at the thought of what Latika was saying?
I'm very impressed because it's about time someone took them on, because monopolies in any market are not a good thing.
Well, it's interesting you should say that because, as you can imagine, this incredible news blackout on Facebook has been very closely watched by politicians and regulators around the world. In the UK, the people that take on monopolies, Gillian, the regulator most likely to do something about this is the Competition and Markets Authority. And Dr. Andrea Cascelli, an economist originally from Parma in Italy, is its chief executive. And on Tuesday, I asked him what his reaction was to Facebook pulling the plug on news in Australia.
I thought it was a symptom of a number of the problems that myself and others think are there, in the sense that you kind of need, I think, monopoly-like power to feel confident that you can take this type of approach. Because first of all, you know, it's important to bear in mind, this is a democratically elected parliament following due process and trying to introduce specific legislation. So it feels to me the bar for a company to decide to go against a democratically elected parliament in this way is pretty high. And certainly, you know, I would be worried if something like this happened in the UK. But secondly, I think you need to feel pretty confident that your customers kind of have nowhere else to go, because you know, in a sense, there clearly was a backlash in Australia. You can assume that a number of people feel pretty strongly about it. But, you know, the reality is there are ecosystems today on Facebook or Instagram they are such that it's very difficult for people individually to switch away, because all of your friends and family are there, and you know, unilaterally, it's very difficult to see, well, you know, I'm so unhappy about this particular action that I'm going to take a stand and do something different. So for me, it's a signal that it's even more urgent, what we are saying, that we need to deal with this economic power, because in many ways, I think this is now also indicative of a degree of kind of political power.
Tech platforms send publishers traffic. They also donate to journalism through charitable efforts. But would it be good for citizens, do you think, and for consumers, from a competition point of view, if technology platforms paid publishers much more?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just a competition argument. Obviously, there is much more about, you know, high-quality journalism, democracy. I mean, I think some of the things, you know, we all witnessed over the last 12 months have given us pause for thought. I mean, I think a number of governments and parliaments in major democracies are struggling with this question, which is that the business model for high-quality independent journalism has been struggling for a number of years, and this has worsened in recent years. And a number of people argue that the bargaining power of the platforms is extremely strong against the publishers, and this is creating a number of distortions. So I personally am in favor of mechanisms that try to think about what is the right balance. It's complicated. I think the Australian approach is a sensible one, which is to try to force the companies into proper commercial negotiations with the backstop of a possible intervention by a regulator. That's one way of doing it. As you probably know, the French are also dealing with it in a slightly different way because they're using the copyright directive. So I think a number of people are struggling with the same problem, trying to come up with slightly different solutions. I mean, my view is very much that the platforms need to be part of the discussion, and this type of approach, this kind of hardball approach, is clearly not helpful and certainly symptomatic of wider problems.
Just to be really clear, because this is very complex, for lots of people who don't spend every day thinking about these issues, they won't necessarily follow it. You say that the Australian approach, you said, is sensible. Can you just explain why? What is it about the Australian approach that you think is sensible?
Well, it's trying basically to create a backstop of mediation and arbitration if the commercial negotiations fail. So it's very much trying to convince the platforms and the publishers to trying to find kind of win-win agreements where there is a fair exchange of money for what is exchanged between the two, but with the backstop that if one of the two sides is unreasonable in the way they approach the problem, ultimately an arbitrator would decide against them.
So you said that Facebook pulling out in the way it did and its behaviour was sort of symptomatic of its monopoly power. Julian Knight, the chair of the Commons Media Select Committee, told the BBC he thought the Facebook move was bullying. He said that pulling the plug on news overnight, I quote, represents the worst type of corporate culture. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, I think that, obviously there are lots of commercial negotiations where people threaten to pull content. So, for instance, in the US, as you know, historically there have been disputes between content providers and cable operators. And there were what are called blackout periods, where at some point they couldn't agree, and the content providers said, well, that's it. I'm not going to give my content to you for the next month. So this happens in terms of commercial negotiations. I think the problem here is that this is in the context of Parliament trying to deal with the problem for democracy and for society, and the approach that Facebook decided to take was very much a commercial approach, but in many ways kind of against a democratically elected parliament, which is personally what I find problematic.
Well, that was the rather outspoken Dr. Andrea Cascelli. He's the head of the Competition and Markets Authority, and you can hear a much longer version of that pretty newsy interview in the Media Show podcast. Look in the BBC Sounds app for that. Latika Bork, Andrea Cascelli suggests there that Facebook holds a monopoly position in the Australian news ecosystem, and I've seen a graph of the referrals that publishers were getting from social media after Facebook's blackout, and they drop off a cliff. So how reliant are Australia's news organisations on Facebook, i.e. where does the power actually lie?
Well, I know at my publication, we made a concerted effort a couple of years ago. You might remember Facebook announced after the Cambridge Analytica scandal that it was changing its news feed away from articles and ads and things and back to the original intent of Facebook, which was people's and their friends' posts. Now, our traffic fell off a cliff then. So we made a concerted effort at that point in time, and it was part of our overall editorial strategy anyway, which was that actually what we want are subscribers, because subscribers are loyal, they appreciate our journalism, they support our journalism, they're very engaged, we have a really engaged readership. And that model has served us very well, not just to withstand this, but also during the pandemic. And so a subscriber model and a focus for us has been a very good transition. And so we are quite happy to see, what it's like laid bare if you don't have Facebook.
So having a business model based on the idea of lots of referrals from social media is dangerous because, as you say, Mark Zuckerberg could turn off the taps anytime he likes. What's the public made of all this in Australia? Whose side are they on?
It's a bit mixed. I mean, the first thing to state is that this legislation is bipartisan supported. So there is support from the left and right for this code. In terms of the public, it's really interesting. There were a lot of people when this blackout first occurred saying, wow, Facebook's a better experience. Not so shouty. It's not full of people who clearly have not read the article that they're commenting on. But then others who were desperate for the news engagement that they sought. And finally, Facebook made a huge blunder because it didn't just turn off news pages. It turned off MPs. It turned off public health authorities pages. It turned off charities.
Some emergency services.
Really, really overreached. And it looked to the rest of the world and to Australians that a big company in Silicon Valley was bullying little old Australia, which is just trying to, get it, make an even kind of go of supporting journalism.
Little old Australia. It's the first time Australia's ever been called little. Sir Nick Clegg, I should say this story is developing fast because Sir Nick Clegg, former Deputy Prime Minister in Britain, Facebook's Vice President of Global Affairs, said in a blog today, and I quote, Facebook would have been forced to pay potentially unlimited amounts of money to multinational media conglomerates without even so much as a guarantee that it is used to pay for journalism, let alone support smaller publishers. What does this episode, I mentioned it in that interview with Dr. Andrea Coscelli, what does this episode, Latika, reveal about the power of Rupert Murdoch in Australia today?
This is a concern. So although this is supported across the parliament, this legislation, there has been a ventilation that this is just a sop to Rupert Murdoch. Now, this is a Conservative government that is putting this legislation through. And the critics of that do say this is basically two tech giants who've disrupted the traditional media model coming along and being forced by government to hand over money to existing media conglomerates that perhaps in the old days might have been seen as monopolies and the gatekeepers of information and news. So there is some disquiet. And one of the MPs who's actually been critical of this, even though his party supports it, is a Labor MP, H. Usick, who's very well informed on this. And he makes this point. He says, as of today, we've got Google and Facebook handing over tens of millions of dollars to these companies. There is so far no obligation and no transparency requirements on those media companies to state how many journalists they will hire with that, how exactly they will spend that, whether that can be transferred immediately to shareholders or not. So this is a live criticism in Australia, and it's not the case that everybody thinks this is a good form of regulation, even if Facebook has misplayed its own hand.
It's fascinating and it's moving fast. Latika, thank you so much for now. David Lloyd, let's bring you in at this point. This reliance on Silicon Valley must be something that you thought about as you were getting your business plan together for Boom Radio. Given that you are not on FM, presumably you rely quite heavily on Amazon and Google to play your station on their smart speakers.
We're on DAB in London. I know Gillian's having trouble getting it. We're on DAB in London on the main multiplex there, and several small-scale ones, Manchester and Glasgow, and a few other places. So DAB is the principal way that people consume radio these days. It accounts certainly in a demographic we're targeting. The lion's share of that. But of course, increasingly people are going to their smart speakers, going to their laptops, going to their phones for their radio stations, and that's going to be a graph that's only going to go up. And we have had a few problems in getting easy smart speaker access for Boom Radio, and you do feel a bit impotent because you can't phone the person up at the transmitter site and say turn us on. It's not as simple as that. So it does pose challenges, and we're no longer the gatekeepers always to how our listeners can hear us.
Well, let's talk about your listeners. Let's talk about Boom Radio. So you launched on Valentine's Day, and you're aimed squarely at baby boomers, the generation born between 1945 and 1963. There are roughly 14 million of them in the UK. Have you got any early indication of how many are listening?
All I can say really is, because we don't have any official radio figures, any audience figures, because nobody has at the moment, and they won't come through for some time. But I can say certainly when we look at our streaming figures and when we look at the response we have had. In my 40 years of radio, I have never read such passionate response for a radio station that's barely a week old. So the response has blown us out the water.
Passionate.
And it's
passionate is one of those funny words, isn't it? It could be good, it could be bad.
I think the number of complaints, probably about half a dozen. The number of people who've written to us, a couple of thousand. It's been phenomenal.
Okay.
People who just say, you have created something that I have been missing. So, just on the figures, I mean, certainly we had in our business plan an idea of the sorts of streaming levels, etc. Well, we've blown those out the water in week one.
Let's hear a bit. I can fade it up live, but we might risk hearing an advert on the BBC. This is just a random blast of Boom Radio from this afternoon.
Bobby Darin, great song. And Things. Before that, Jerry and the Pacemakers and their second number one, I Like It. Jerry Marsden, leader of the Pacemakers, sadly died on the 3rd of January, but his music lives on. Now, time to blow the dust off another one of these.
It's David Hamilton's Hot Shot.
Well, that is a very particular sound. David Hamilton, I'm not going to use the word legend again. Oops, I just did. He, of course, presented the final edition of Housewife's Choice back in 1967. You've got a very old-school radio jingle. You've got some close harmony singers that seem to have walked straight out of the golden years. I want to rattle through your business idea very quickly, David, before bringing Gillian in. Quickly, what's the ownership structure? Who owns Boom Radio?
It's a handful of people who've been in the radio business a long time who actually were tempted by this proposition. So, it's a handful of private individuals, myself, Chief Executive Phil Riley, and a few others. Yeah.
How much money did you have to raise?
About $250,000.
How much? You've got news bulletins. How much do they cost you?
Just a few thousand. They're from independent radio news, so Sky. So, fairly nominal amount.
What's your unique selling proposition?
We are targeted at people aged 60 to 75, and they are not addressed by
Greatest Hits Radio, Gold, Scala, Bits of Absolute, Radio 2.
You heard the songs we played this afternoon. Greatest Hits Radio is an enormously successful offering. 70s and 80s, that's where they live. I've written to listeners saying, if you think we're a bit old, try Greatest Hits Radio. We go back, 60s and 70s is where we predominate, a sprinkling of 50s and more recent material. So there is nothing quite like the mix we play. Thousands of songs, variety, but set in those key decades of 60s and 70s.
Marvellous. Okay, Gillian Reynolds, what's your take?
I think it's not so much the music, because I defer, of course, to David's greater expertise in this. But if you tune around, you'll hear quite a lot of the same music on Caroline, which is on DAB, on Greatest Hits, a bit of replication there, Union Jack, a bit of crossover there. But I think it's in the presentation. The presentation is, it's comfortable, it's homey, it's radio like it used to be, where people talk to you. They don't just do link in, link out, whip over to the competition. It's much more conversational. And I think that is, in a way, what distinguishes it, makes it warmer, and people feel at home with it, like they felt, like they haven't felt at home with radio that just shouts at you and slots another disc in.
And Gillian, do you think that the argument, which is put about, I hear it a lot, this argument that local radio stations, even Radio 2, are now chasing a younger, more diverse audience and therefore have abandoned the people that David's going after? Do you think that's fair?
Well, I saw a very interesting letter this afternoon to the controller Radio 2 about the recent musicals series. And this letter was politely addressed, and it said, why were the shows on so late? And the reply said, because we want to drive consciously older listeners to sounds. And it's absolutely astonishing that this would happen and be open. Well, not everybody wants to listen to sounds. Not everybody wants to go and find the other service. People want to turn the radio on. It's a friend. It's the person you have in the kitchen with you, the person you go to bed with, if you don't mind me saying so. And it's a different relationship. I think it's odd.
And how easy do you think it is, Gillian, for a newcomer like David? I mean, it's obviously an extraordinary logistical challenge getting going in a pandemic. We take your hat off to you, David. But in terms of the editorial challenge, how easy is it, Gillian, for a newcomer to challenge big radio groups like Bauer Media?
It's very difficult, I would think, because 3 big radio groups have it pretty much sewn up between them. There's Global, which is all the capital stations, Absolute and all those. It's Bauer, which owns Scala and has a great spread across other things. And there's the people I work for, News Corp, now have their own radio stations, Virgin and Times Radio. And it's very difficult to break in to a market that has big money behind it and big buying power. And you can tell it by the adverts, actually. But I think if David persists, and maybe they'll come along and ask him to sell to them, but I don't think that's what he's there for. I think he's found an audience that feels underloved. And don't forget, Amol, The baby boomers have been the dominant demographic ever since the 1960s. And they've dominated everything: taste, in clothes, in style, in achievement. And if you like that kind of music, why not have a radio station for it? Me, it's a bit tame. I'm more of a soul girl.
Last word to you, David Lloyd.
Yeah, I think with Radio 2, I have to say, I think it's programmed brilliantly, and I can say exactly what they're doing. I wrote about it in my blog 2 years ago. They're moving into a particular demographic territory, but I think it's rather disingenuous to think that you can target with a mainstream music radio station a 35-year-old and also target people double that age.
Why is it disingenuous? I'm really into Motown. I'm also into hip-hop.
I agree.
Well, all the people who program radio stations will say actually need a focus. The people who program Capital know the exact songs which chime best with their audience. And if you look through Radio 2's, if you look at Radio 2's 65-year-old listeners, the array of music that Radio 2 plays is not for them anymore. And we've had thousands of comments saying that, and our research said that as well. It's a great blend, but it's not for them anymore.
Well, the fact that you've researched it, the fact that there seems, in your argument, to be both a gap in the market and a market in the gap suggests that there are a lot of people who still love radio, which is obviously a good thing, not least for this show. Thank you very much indeed to all of you for your contributions today. Really appreciate it. Gillian Reynolds, who's the radio critic of the Sunday Times, David Lloyd, the boss of the new Boom Radio, and Latika Bork, who is from the Sydney Morning Herald. And earlier we heard from Dr. Andrea Coscelli, the Chief Executive of the Competition and Markets Authority. Thank you so much to John Boland, today's studio engineer, and thank you to you for listening. Goodbye.